Today's title is Radically Social. And you've probably heard and you see on the agenda that we have 4 key words that we're looking at today. First, place, and then we have create, identity, and community. And for me, a key title, personally, that runs through all of today is sense of belonging. Sense of belonging in terms of place, in terms of creativity, in terms of your community, and as well as your identity. Our sense of belonging, what does that mean? How do you define your sense of belonging? We live now in a world which is more fragmented than ever. The level of hate crimes at its highest level in Britain, the level of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism continues to increase year upon year. Bigotry, fascism, the rise of the far right. The question I always ask myself, and I find it very, very interesting, despite the world in the early 21st century being more interconnected than ever, I want to ask you this question: how connected are we as a community? They are 2 very different things. With the invention of digital media, social media, Twitter, Instagram, the hashtags that we see right before us today on the stage, despite all of the ease that we have at our fingertip to be in touch with those family members, whether they're in this country or halfway across the globe, thousands of miles away, we still lack that interaction with one another. And personally, as you heard, a British Muslim who has many, many passions, which you'll come to see. Some of you will think I'm ambitious, others will think I'm probably deluded when it comes to them. But as a young boy growing up in London, West London, my passion was football. Like any young kid growing up, to become a Premier League football player. And at the same time, of course, till this day, my father says, "I told you so. You shouldn't have gone down that route. I'm glad you went down the education route." But still to this day, I want to become a Premier League football player. I just hope they introduce something equivalent to the Rooney Rule, where they say, if you're above the age of 30 and hold a PhD, then you have a trial at a Premier League football club. That probably won't happen. Another big, big passion of mine is bringing communities together. I've always been fascinated with identities, cultures, languages. I come from a background where my academic focus is looking at public diplomacy, the role of soft power, the role of being able to, the arena that we live in, and we all have them, are hearts and minds. And if the arena of hearts and minds is true to that statement, and we believe in that, then surely our understanding of one another is through feelings and thought, to reach out to those hearts and minds. You may have heard of the term winning the hearts and minds, or winning hearts and minds. I have issue with that. Hearts and minds are not lost for them to be won. On the contrary, I come from a school of thought where the hearts and minds perhaps need to be softened. And that's what I want to present to you today. This is a volunteer praying in a public park in central London behind the British Museum. This park is where we have been holding our Open Iftars, which is a platform where we invite people of all faiths and none to come together and explore what Ramadan is, to break fast, free food, to meet one another, turning strangers into friends. This is Adam in a park where he's praying. We create a space of spirituality, dialogue, empowerment for young British Muslims. And referring back to the first point, which was sense of belonging. This park was actually used in the Second World War as a form of barracks for the British Army. And a few yards away from this park is where the Senate House stands. And notoriously, you may have heard this before, Hitler once said that if he had conquered Britain, he would make Senate House the HQ. And that no longer is the case. Rather, we have people of many different backgrounds coming together, praying in the heart of London, sharing that wonderful, unique community spirit that we so long for, and yet we think it's easy, but it isn't. One of the most inspirational verses to me personally, reading the Quran, is this verse here. People, God is speaking to people, not to Muslims, to people, saying, we created you all from a single man and a single woman, and made you into races and tribes so that you should recognize one another. In God's eyes, the most honored of you are those who are most mindful of Him. God is all-knowing, all-aware. And for me, why is this inspiring is the different nations, races, and tribes that were created. There's a beautiful hidden wisdom behind this verse, which I've actually internalized, and through my academic work and practice, I've come to realize that actually through this hidden wisdom, God purposely created us differently. And the wisdom behind that is to get to know one another. Right? If God had created us all equal, i.e. from the same race, same language, there would be no rationale to get to know the other, to recognize the other. And this is where unity and diversity is my takeaway from this verse. Here are some of the images that we have in our Open Iftar. People of all faiths, etc., coming together from all backgrounds, being able to have that human interaction. And for me, what I find very, very interesting is that when we speak of multicultural society, the issue I have is we speak of it as if we have various silos where people live in parallel lives. They exist, but not living. They exist without communicating with one another. And for me, my biggest pet peeve, if you will, is that you cannot exist without being able to have that relationship with the other person, to understand the other, to create this space in a place that we live in today, this public place and public space that we have to take use of and be able to bridge build and to bring people together from different faiths. And again, you've heard already, the misconceptions that my faith has had in the media for several years. And for me, my biggest motivation was in 2011. Now, 2011, I forgot to mention, of course, we invite people of all ages as well, so as you can see. In 2011, we had several world events that happened, right? We had the start of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, which then spiraled into Egypt and later on into the Levant region. Here at home in the UK, if you recall, the late summer of 2011, we had the London riots, the Tottenham riots, which then spread across the UK. And I was just finishing off my master's program in international studies and diplomacy. And I was thinking to myself, I wanted to do something, it was during the month of Ramadan, I wanted to do something active in the communities. And I thought to myself, well, why not create a flash mob iftar? Invite people to come together, create something hopeful, create something in which we, using a space that we have, the places that we live in, to invite people of all faiths. And I have this quote here because one of my favorite museums, of course, my favorite museum now will be this museum, obviously. This is the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Anyone been to the Victoria and Albert Museum? Yeah? Now, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but actually there's an inscription on the entrance, which reads this: "The excellence of every art consists in the accomplishment of its purpose." If we were to think about the excellence of every art, we are all, for me anyway, art subjects. We are all different. We are all created. We are all various different art forms. And the excellence of our purpose is what? The accomplishment of its purpose. Our purpose in life is to figure out what it is and excelling in that. And you'll see a lot of references that I make is to a few French philosophers who I have much admiration for when it comes to this field of place and space. Claude Lefort once talked about the democratic public place or space, it should be, and it needs to be rather, large enough to accommodate only those who recognize one another within it and who gives it a meaning. Is there a clear pattern here between this and the verse that we read? To recognize, right? We have these spaces, these spatial spaces, and Henri Lefebvre, another French philosopher, who talks about the power of space, in that space in itself and a place that we live in is a social construct, where in itself is a form of social interaction. You leave here, there is a space, there is you look outside the window, there is a space. When you're driving, etc., when you're traveling from one city to another, all these places and spaces exist. And it should be accommodated and used to invite all together and explore our differences, but being appreciative of them. This is an image of back in 2013, where we held our first Ramadan campaign, 30 nights straight, the whole of Ramadan, inviting people. This is on the grounds of SOAS University of London, where we opened up the invitation to people who are rough sleepers, people working in the city. Everyone was welcomed. And since then, the journey began with actually a trolley. So you probably will hear this. You're very privileged, I may say, that you hear the story. That in 2011, I mentioned to you about the recent events that happened in London back then. This is me, a lot younger, with a few bottles of drinks and some boxes of water and dates, 2 tables, 20 people turning up. That was the sort of story back in 2011. And that grew into what you see here. And then this was a couple of years ago in London, hosting about 300 to 350 people every night in London. Is anyone familiar with where this is? I hear some murmurs here and there. Yes, you're right. It is indeed Centenary Square in Bradford. We came up here last year, and we had about 400 people attending that event. And again, what you see here is the use of space, public space, walking through Centenary Square. How many people walk through that every single day without pausing, reflecting, sitting down, eating with a stranger, turning them into a friend, having a conversation? Very, very rare. Since our inception, I believe there's another image there. Yeah. Since our inception, we've hosted over 70,000 people across 10 cities and 4 continents. Starting off with a trolley, with an idea, a concept, which grew into what it is today, a movement. We organized the first ever Open Iftar in Tate Britain's 121-year history. They have never had an event like this at Tate Britain. Tate Britain, of course, as you know, as Tate Modern, etc., they are all public spaces. They are bankrolled by the taxpayers' money. In its 121-year history, nothing like this has happened. Why? This event, we had 500 people attending. And here we had the honor and absolute privilege of organizing an Open Iftar for the Grenfell 1-year memorial, where over 5,000 people attended. We were handpicked by the survivors and the bereaved family members. I actually live in that area. I knew family members who lived in the tower, who sadly are no longer with us. And it was an absolute pleasure to be at service to the community. So you see up and down the country, in various institutions, the idea to tap into and recreate this space. Now, I did say I was maybe ambitious or deluded, so maybe you can take away whatever you want to take away from this. There was a Game for Grenfell match, which was organized by QPR, Queen's Park Rangers Football Club. I wouldn't imagine there's any fans of that club, but I'll ask anyway. Anyone? No? I'll move on very swiftly, as I knew. There were many celebrities at that game. I'm not sure if you were aware. You had Sir Mo Farah, you had Jamie Redknapp, you had Peter Crouch, you had Alan Shearer, Ian Wright, Ben Shepherd, a few other sort of A-list celebrities, and you had someone called Jose Mourinho. Jose Mourinho is, or was, the former Manchester United football manager. He turned up on the day, unexpected, and he said, I want to play. I want to feature in this game. That's him in goal. Jose Mourinho. And that's me taking the penalty against Jose Mourinho. I did score, yes. Yeah, I wouldn't be showing this otherwise. So I did score, and I haven't got the clip here, but I'm more than happy to share the clip with you, of course, afterwards. Where you will see, after I scored the penalty, my instant reaction was, obviously you celebrate, but it's only a penalty. And this was a penalty shootout. So the game ended 1-1, and then we went to penalties. And I had this, it was incredibly surreal. I had Les Ferdinand, who was a legend at Newcastle and also played for QPR and also actually grew up in the area near Grenfell. Came up to me and he said, look, do you fancy a penalty? And I said, of course I'd fancy a penalty. Yeah, sure. And he said, right, you're up. And I said, okay. And before I went, actually, I want to mention this. Ben Shepherd said to me, look, before you go, just take it all in. You know, you're in a stadium with 18,000 people. Chances are, this happening again, yeah, very slim. And I took that on board, and I just walked from the halfway line towards the penalty spot, took my time, and I looked around the stadium, and I just taking it all in, thinking, what an incredible journey so far. And my father actually was in the stand, watching the game. He was an avid football fan. After I scored, I turned, my instant reaction was pointing into the stand, and I was pointing to my father. As a way to serve a reminder that, I mean, I won this one, you know. He may have won the battle, but I won the war, so. But it was just incredibly surreal and to see how deluded I was at the time. But going back to, obviously, you know, the idea of space in itself, I think it's incredibly important that something for us to take away today. In an extremely hierarchical society, we take the notion of actually people, and I mean hundreds of people, sitting together in a public square with people they've never met, from different parents, although gathered as brothers and sisters in humanity, sharing a meal, listening to a talk, feeling good about themselves, and then leaving, is actually in itself radically social. I want to end with a last few points, and this one as well is a conversation between a man asked the Prophet Muhammad, which act in Islam is the best? And he responded, to give food and to greet everyone, whether you know or you do not know. And that for me is a great, sort of living embodiment. As someone who's a British Muslim, I looked at that and I think that's exactly what we do. You know, people we know, we don't know. Going back to the verse about recognizing one another for different faiths, for different tribes, for different races. And I'd like to end with this. Service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth. If your room on earth is your place, then what service are you giving back? And as we mentioned earlier, if we have hundreds of people across the globe sitting together, although a very simple and basic concept, it is actually very radical in its nature. So I'd like to end with that and finish with this quote, as it is Muhammad Ali's birthday tomorrow. I thought it was quite fitting for that. I'd like to thank you all for your attention. Thank you very much.